In the Missouri Ozarks of 1877, 32 loggers went up Bearcut Ridge. Only 5 came down. A company camp promised good wages at the end of a mule track. Then the pay receipts stopped. Supply orders for flour were replaced with quicklime. For decades, the only trace was a company ledger with one question penciled in the margin. Others? This is how their secret finally surfaced, through a child's drawing of a long trench and a map of a cold cellar that was never on any survey. But the company man vanished, and the ridge road washed away. When the town itself fell silent, who had the courage to dig for the dead, and what did it cost to make the ridge finally give up its ghosts? Let us know where you're watching from, and the time, in the comments. If honoring the lost matters to you, subscribe to keep their truth alive. The whole thing began with dust, not the fine red dust of a dry Ozark summer, but the gray, settled dust of 60 years of forgetting. In 1937, the Works Progress Administration sent crews of young men into the basements and vaults of county courthouses all across Missouri. Their job was simple, if not easy: to save what could be saved. To take the brittle, water-stained records of a previous century, deeds, tax rolls, marriage licenses, and give them a clean, dry home. It was a way to preserve the past, and a way to earn $1 a day in a time when $1 was hard to find. Down in the stone-walled vault of the Taney County Courthouse, a young man named Frank Miller coughed into his sleeve. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and damp earth. For 3 days, his only company had been the whisper of his own movements and the heavy thud of ledgers being moved from rotting wooden shelves to new steel ones. Most of the books were unremarkable. County business. Property lines drawn and redrawn, the neat sloping cursive of clerks long since turned to dust themselves. But on the 4th day, near the back of a shelf holding records from the timber boom of the 1870s, he found one that was different. It was a paymaster's ledger, bound in scuffed brown leather, its spine cracked like a dry creek bed. The cover was blank, but the first page read, in surprisingly elegant ink, "Bearcut Creek Logging Concern, account for 1877. Frank opened it. Page after page listed names, wages paid, and supplies disbursed: flour, salt pork, blasting powder, saw blades. The columns were tidy, the work of a man who valued order. He was about to stack it with the others when he saw the pencil mark. It was in the bottom margin of a page dated September 1877. The handwriting was nothing like the careful ink in the columns. It was a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, pressed so hard into the paper that it had left an impression on the page behind it. A simple accounting note, a final tally for the season. But it made no sense. It read, 32 men hired, 5 discharged. Others? That was all. Just the word others, followed by a question mark that hung in the silence of the vault like a noose. Frank Miller, who was only 19 and knew more about hungry bellies than he did about old secrets, stared at the question. It felt wrong. In a book filled with numbers and facts, a question was an intruder. He showed it to his supervisor, who shrugged and passed it up the line. The ledger was set aside, an anomaly in a mountain of paperwork, and there it might have stayed if it hadn't eventually found its way to the one man in the county who might still remember what that question meant. His name was Elias Pruitt, and he was 81 years old. He'd served as the county clerk for nearly half a century before retiring, and it was said he knew the history of every plot of land and every family name within 100 miles. His memory was a library of its own, filled with details others had long since discarded. When the WPA historians brought him the ledger, they found him on the porch of his small white house, mending a leather strap. He took the book with hands gnarled by age but still steady. He didn't need his spectacles to read the cover. He just ran a thumb over the worn leather, his eyes distant. "Bearcut Creek," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "I haven't heard that name in a long, long time." They opened it to the page with the pencil mark. Elias stared at the question for a full minute, his face unreadable. Then he looked up, not at the young historians, but past them, as if seeing a ghost on the horizon. "The Bearcut crew," he said softly. "Yes, I remember them." This is how their secret finally surfaced. Not with a shout, but with a whisper, from a man whose job it had been to record the simple facts. and who had been haunted for a lifetime by the one fact that had gone missing. Elias Pruitt invited the men inside. His home was like a miniature courthouse, with ledgers of his own creation lining the walls. He kept logs of weather patterns, crop yields, and the dates of every notable birth and death in the county for 70 years. To him, the world was a story told in facts, and the greatest sin was an incomplete record. He explained that back in 1877, the timber companies were moving through the Ozarks like a slow-burning fire. The war had been over for a dozen years, and the nation was rebuilding. It needed wood. Men, many of them veterans who had seen the worst of the fighting at places like Shiloh and Vicksburg, were desperate for work. A man with a strong back and a willingness to face the hardship of a logging camp could earn a decent wage. When the Bearcut Creek Logging Concern set up its office in town, it felt like a blessing. The company agent was a man from back east named Horace Delling. Elias described him as smooth-faced and well-dressed, a man whose boots were never muddy. He had a way of speaking that made promises sound like guarantees. He paid for supplies in cash, and he hired 32 men in the space of a week. Elias had been a young deputy clerk back then, not much older than Frank Miller was now. He'd seen the men line up to sign the company roster. He remembered their faces, hard men, quiet men. Men who were used to taking orders and sleeping on the ground. They had names like Boone and Sutter and Cole, fathers and sons, and brothers who had stood together in battle and were now standing together again, ready to swing an axe instead of a rifle. They went up the ridge in late spring, Elias said, his finger tracing a line on an invisible map in the air. Bearcut Creek is isolated. Even today it's hard country. Back then there was one mule track in and the same track out. Once they were up there, they were on their own. For the first few months, everything seemed normal. A paymaster would ride down from the camp every few weeks to send money orders back to the families and purchase supplies. Then, in late summer, the paymaster stopped coming. Delling himself would ride into town, saying the crew was working a new, more remote section of the ridge and he was handling the books himself. People accepted it. Delling was a company man after all. But the letters home, the ones the wives and mothers depended on, became less frequent. And then they stopped altogether. When winter closed in, the Bearcut Creek operation went silent. Horace Delling assured everyone it was normal. The crew was wintering over, he said. They were stockpiling lumber for the spring thaw. The snows came early and heavy that year, cutting the ridge off completely. And when spring arrived, the Bearcut Creek Logging Concern was gone. Delling had cleared out his office overnight. The mule track was washed out in a landslide, and the 32 men, they never came down. The official story, the one the company provided in a letter a month later, was that the crew had been paid a winter bonus and had disbanded. They'd moved on, the letter said, following the work west. But Elias Pruitt knew the men. He knew their families. They weren't the kind to just walk away, he told the young historians, his voice low and certain. Not without a word, not without their pay. Those men had wives and children waiting for them. You don't just walk away from that. He picked up the ledger again and turned the brittle pages. He showed them the meticulous entries from the first few months. Then he pointed to the last few pages, the ones from late summer. The handwriting changed. It was still Delling's, but it was hurried. Less precise. The supply lists grew strange. Less food, more tools. An order for 20 shovels, another for a dozen pickaxes. And then, a final order, the last entry before the page, with the penciled question. It was for 500 pounds of quicklime. Why does a logging camp, Elias asked, the question hanging in the still air of his parlor, need 500 pounds of quicklime right before it shuts down for winter? No one had an answer. The county marshal at the time made a brief inquiry, but Delling was gone, the camp was inaccessible, and the company lawyers from back east sent letters that buried the whole affair in legal threats. The matter was dropped. The families grieved, the town whispered, and eventually, the mystery of the Bearcut crew faded into memory. It became a local ghost story, a cautionary tale told to children about not wandering too far up the hollows. For 60 years, that's all it was. Until a young man in a dusty vault found a question mark, scrawled in a moment of fear or guilt, or perhaps a desperate attempt at confession. Elias Pruitt closed the ledger gently, as if putting a tired body to rest. "This book," he said to the historians, "is where the story ended. But I think it's also where it begins again." To understand what happened up on Bearcut Creek, you have to understand the contract. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a promise made in a time when promises were all a man had. The year was 1877. The country was still stitching itself together after the war. Railroads were pushing west, cities were rising from the prairie, and all of it was being built with wood. The ancient forests of the Ozarks were like a bank vault that had just been opened, and men like Horace Delling held the key. He arrived in town that spring, not with a bang, but with the quiet confidence of a man who knows he has something everyone wants: wages. He was from a timber concern based in St. Louis, a company with a long name and an even longer reach. He rented a small office on the main street and set a sign in the window: "Men wanted, good pay for hard work." And the men came. They came from small farms where the soil was thin and the winters were long. They came from towns that still bore the scars of the conflict. Many were veterans, men who had learned how to sleep on cold ground and follow orders without question. They were in their 30s and 40s, with lines etched around their eyes from sights they wished they could forget. Now, all they wanted was to earn enough to feed their families, to build a life in the quiet that followed the cannon fire. Elias Pruitt, from his perch as the deputy clerk, watched them file into Delling's office. He saw their hardened hands more accustomed to a rifle stock or a plow handle, carefully take the pen Delling offered. The contract was simple enough: a standard timber agreement. Pay was 50 cents a day, plus room and board at the company camp on the ridge. The term was for 6 months, from the spring thaw until the first heavy snow. It was good money, honest money. At the bottom of each contract, Horace Delling signed his name with a flourish, a confident, looping signature that spoke of Eastern schools and sound finances. The men made their mark with a simple X, their names printed beside it by Delling himself. 32 X's on 32 contracts. A small army of axemen, sawyers, and teamsters assembled in less than a week. What stayed with Elias, 60 years later, was the look in their eyes. It wasn't greed, it was hope. A tired, cautious hope that maybe, finally, things were going to get better. This hope was a fragile thing, carried in letters sent home before they left. Letters folded and stored in family Bibles, later shared with the historians. One, from a man named Thomas Sutter to his wife, read simply: "Martha, I have signed on for the season at Bearcut Creek. Mr. Delling says the pay is steady. Send word of the children. I will send my pay when I can." Another, from a young man of 17, his first time away from home: "Mama, don't you worry. The older men say the work is hard but the food is plenty. I will come back a rich man." They left town in a long, slow procession of wagons and mules, heading up the winding dirt track that led into the high country. Bearcut Creek wasn't just a place, it was a fortress of nature. The ridge was walled in by steep ravines and dense thickets of oak and hickory. The mule track was the only way in or out, a thin thread connecting the camp to the world below. Once the men crossed the first creek and entered the deep woods, they were effectively gone. The sounds of the town faded, replaced by the constant sigh of the wind through the pines. They were in a world of their own, a world governed by the company, by the rhythm of the saw, and by the authority of the man who had hired them. For the first 2 months, everything ran like clockwork. The paymaster, a quiet man named Thompson, rode down every other Saturday with a pouch full of letters and money orders. The town's general store did brisk business selling supplies to the camp: barrels of flour and salt pork, sacks of beans and coffee, crates of tobacco. Then, in July, the routine changed. The paymaster, Thompson, was reassigned, according to Delling. From that point on, Delling himself would handle all the finances. He was a constant presence in town, always polite, always paying in cash drawn from a bank in Springfield. But the money orders sent to the families slowed to a trickle. When wives would inquire, Delling had a ready explanation. The men were saving their wages, he'd say, putting it aside for a big payout at the end of the season. It was a plausible story, and he was a plausible man, but it's in the paperwork where the truth begins to bleed through. The documents, preserved by the slow, indifferent passage of time, tell a different story. In the county registrar's office, filed away and forgotten, was a duplicate of the land use permit issued to the Bearcut Creek logging concern. On that document, Horace Delling's signature is different. It is not the open, flowing script from the employment contracts. It is a tight, cramped signature. H. Davies. 2 names. 2 identities. A small detail easily missed. A man might use a different name for business, perhaps for tax reasons, but it was a crack in the smooth facade. A signal that the man the town knew as Horace Delling was not the only man he was. The most damning evidence, however, lay within the pages of the ledger itself, the very one Frank Miller found in the dusty courthouse vault. As you trace the entries from spring into summer, you see the lifeblood of the camp recorded in neat columns. Flour, bacon, molasses, kerosene. Then the entries for late August begin. The orders become erratic, and then they become strange. A charge for 20 new shovels, though no new men had been hired. An order for 12 heavy pickaxes. Then the floor drops out from under you. On a supply manifest dated September 3rd, there is an order for 100 pounds of flour. The word flour is neatly crossed out. Beside it, in Delling's faster, more urgent hand, is a single word: quicklime. A week later, another order: 200 pounds of salt pork, crossed out, replaced with 2 kegs of blasting powder. And finally, the last supply run before the camp went silent: a request for 5 barrels of flour. All 5 are crossed out, and beside them the final entry, the one Elias Pruitt had pointed to with a trembling finger. 500 pounds quicklime. The contract had promised food and board, but the ledger shows the menu had changed. The tools were no longer for logging, they were for digging. The supplies were no longer for sustaining life, but for erasing it. The promise of the Ridge contract had been a lie from the very beginning. The camp wasn't a workplace, it was a trap, and as the first cold winds of autumn began to sweep down from the high country, the trap was about to be sprung. As the autumn of 1877 deepened, a quiet unease settled over the small towns at the foot of the Ozark ridges. The brilliant reds and golds of the hickory and maple trees seemed, to some, a little too bright that year, like a fever blush before the chill. The men of the Bearcut Creek camp had been gone for 5 months, and the silence from the mountain was no longer peaceful. It was heavy. Horace Delling was still a presence in town, but he had changed. The easy smile was still there, but it didn't always reach his eyes. He spent less time at the general store and more time at the telegraph office. When asked about the crew, his answers became shorter, more dismissive. "They're fine," he'd say, working hard before the snows. But rumors, like seeds on the wind, began to take root. A farmer whose land bordered the timber company's lease claimed he'd heard blasting from up the ridge at odd hours, not the rhythmic pop of clearing stumps, but heavy, concussive booms that echoed through the hollows in the dead of night. Another man, a trapper who walked the high country, mentioned seeing smoke rising from the camp, but never saw any men. "It was a strange sort of quiet up there," he later told the marshal. "Too quiet for a camp of 30 men. The families of the loggers were growing desperate. Letters sent to the company office were returned, unopened. Wives walked into town, their faces etched with a worry that had curdled into fear, only to be met by Delling's practiced reassurances. He told one woman her husband had taken a bonus and headed for the silver mines in Colorado. He told another that her son had run off with a paymaster's daughter. He spun a dozen different tales, all of them designed to do one thing: buy time. And then the first snows came, a full 2 weeks earlier than usual. A thick, wet blanket of white that covered the landscape, smoothing over the sharp edges of the land and sealing the high country away from the world below. The Bearcut Creek mule track became impassable. The lost camp, as it was now beginning to be called, was truly lost. The silence from the mountain was now absolute. In this growing silence, one person refused to let the questions die. Her name was Martha Keene, and she was the town's schoolteacher. She was a woman in her late 40s, unmarried, with a quiet strength that people often mistook for shyness. She had taught the children of this valley for 20 years. Some of the men up on Bearcut Creek were fathers of her students. One of them was the boy of 17 who had promised his mother he'd come back a rich man. He had sat in the back row of her one-room schoolhouse just a year earlier. Martha Keene had a habit that the townspeople found eccentric. She kept scrapbooks, not of family photos or pressed flowers, but of news. She clipped articles from the Springfield and St. Louis newspapers, pasting them into large, leather-bound volumes. She believed that history wasn't just made by generals and presidents, but by the small, everyday events that shaped the lives of ordinary people. In the autumn of 1877, her scrapbook began to focus on one story: the missing men. She clipped the small, ignored notices about the company. She wrote down the dates of Delling's visits to town. She began, in her neat schoolteacher's hand, to make a list of the men's names, and beside each name, the names of their wives and children. It was more than a list. It was an act of remembrance, a refusal to let these men become ghosts. She didn't work in a courthouse or a marshal's office. She didn't have a badge or a ledger. But she had something just as powerful: the trust of the community. People talked to Martha Keene. They told her their fears in a way they wouldn't dare voice to the authorities. One of her students, a quiet boy of 10 named Samuel, whose father was a farmer near the ridge, told her something that made a cold knot tighten in her stomach. He said his father had seen something one night in late September. He'd been awakened by the sound of his dogs barking, a frantic, terrified sound. From the window of his loft, he saw lanterns moving up on the mule track. Not one or two, but a whole string of them, bobbing in the darkness. He saw the silhouettes of men with shovels over their shoulders. But they weren't his neighbors, and they weren't the Bearcut crew. They were strangers. He watched them for nearly an hour, digging by lantern light in a clearing not far from the main track. Then they covered their work and were gone before the sun came up. Samuel's father was a cautious man. He didn't want trouble. He hadn't told the marshal. But he told his son, and his son, in the innocent way of children who do not yet know which truths are safe to tell, told his teacher. Martha Keene wrote it all down in her scrapbook: the date, the time, the description of the strangers digging at night. A few days later, one of her youngest students, the 6-year-old daughter of one of the missing loggers, gave her a drawing. Children's drawings are often a mix of reality and fantasy. Stick figures with smiling faces under a bright yellow Sunday. But this drawing was different. It showed a long, dark shape on the ground, a trench. And sticking out of the trench were what looked like boots, little black shapes all in a row. "That's where Daddy is sleeping," the little girl said, her voice small and matter-of-fact. "He's taking a long nap under the ground." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. She took the drawing and carefully folded it, placing it between the pages of her scrapbook. She was beginning to understand. The dread that had been a whisper in the back of her mind was now becoming a roar. The danger hadn't been on the ridge. The danger was the ridge. The company, the camp, the contract, it was all a facade. It was a machine designed to lure men into isolation, and the host of that camp, Horace Delling, was not a provider. He was a predator. The realization landed with the force of a physical blow. 32 men had walked into that camp. The company claimed they had all left. But the evidence, the whispers, the ledgers, and a child's simple drawing all pointed to a different, horrifying conclusion. Someone was going to have to answer for those 32 men. The question was, who would have the courage to ask? The town marshal was outmatched. The county was too big, and its resources too small. And Horace Delling, the man with 2 names and a dozen lies, had faded like a bad dream. It seemed that the silence from the lost camp would last forever, buried under a winter's snow and a town's fear. But Martha Keene kept her scrapbook, and in the patient, meticulous pages of her book, the truth was not sleeping. It was waiting. When you're hunting for a truth that's been deliberately buried, you don't look for a single shining piece of evidence. You look for patterns. You gather the small, scattered fragments, a bank draft, a supply manifest, a note on the weather, and you lay them side by side. You look for the places where the story doesn't line up, where the official record zigs and the quiet facts zag. This is the slow, patient work of unmasking a predator. It's not about the flash of a gunshot, it's about the steady drip of ink on a ledger, slowly revealing a stain that can't be washed away. 60 years after the Bearcut camp vanished, The historians, guided by Elias Pruitt's memory and Martha Keene's scrapbook, began to assemble these fragments. They laid them out on a long wooden table in the courthouse annex, turning the room into a headquarters for a 60-year-old manhunt. The first pieces were financial. They found bank drafts from the Merchants' Bank in Springfield, drawn by Horace Delling. In the spring and early summer of 1877, the drafts were regular, paying for the usual supplies. But in August, the pattern shifted. The payments became larger, more erratic, and they weren't made out to the local general store. They were made to a pharmaceutical supplier in St. Louis. The manifest for one of these shipments listed medical supplies: bandages, iodine, quinine for fever. But tucked at the bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, was an order for 3 large vials of laudanum and a crate of something called Dr. Good's Calming Tonic. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was common enough. A few drops could soothe a toothache or quiet a cough. But 3 large vials was a hospital supply. And Dr. Good's Calming Tonic was a patent medicine known for one thing: it was potent. Marketed to soothe nerves and aid sleep, its main ingredients were alcohol and a heavy dose of chloral hydrate, a sedative powerful enough to knock a man out for hours. In the quiet of the courthouse annex, a dark possibility began to form. Why would a logging camp of 32 healthy men need a crate of powerful sedatives? It was a question that hung in the air, thick and menacing. The answer came from a place no one expected: the memories of a man who was then a boy. His name was Jacob Early, and in 1877 he'd been a 14-year-old teamster's boy helping his father haul supplies up the lower part of the mule track. His father had died years ago, but Jacob, now a stooped man in his 70s with eyes that had seen too much, remembered Horace Delling. He was a smooth one, Jacob told the historians. Always had a kind word and a piece of hard candy for me. Jacob recalled the last few supply runs his father made for the camp in late summer. They weren't allowed to go all the way to the camp anymore. Delling would meet them at a halfway point, a place they called the Turnaround Rock. He said it was to save the mules the last steep climb. Delling would unload the supplies himself, always in a hurry, with 2 grim-faced men Jacob had never seen before helping him. These men didn't speak, they just worked, their eyes constantly scanning the trees. Jacob's most chilling memory was of the camp's cook, a man named Henderson, who rode down with Delling on one of the last trips. Henderson looked sick, his hands were shaking and his face was pale. Jacob's father asked him if he was getting enough to eat up on the ridge. Henderson just shook his head and looked away, but not before Jacob heard him mutter, "It's the stew, it's the sleepy stew." He wouldn't say another word. He quit the next day, taking half his pay, and practically running out of town. At the time, Jacob thought it was strange. Now, 60 years later, sitting across from the historians with a copy of the pharmaceutical manifest on the table, the phrase "sleepy stew" took on a terrifying new meaning. The tonics and the sedatives weren't for medical use. They were an ingredient, a way to keep a camp of strong, hardened men docile, compliant, asleep. The pattern was becoming clearer, the picture darker with each new piece. But the final, critical fragment came from the county surveyor's office. Among the old property maps was the original survey of the Bearcut Creek timber lease, drawn in 1876. It was a detailed map, showing the contours of the land, the creeks, the stands of pine and oak. The WPA team compared this official survey with a rough, hand-drawn map they'd found tucked into the back of the paymaster's ledger, Delling's map. For the most part, the 2 maps matched, but on Delling's version, there was one addition: a small spur trail branching off from the main mule track, leading to a point marked with a simple, stark X. Beside the X was a handwritten note: the cold cellar. There was no cold cellar on the official survey. It wasn't a natural feature like a cave or a spring. It was something Delling had either found or made. A hidden place, off the books, known only to him and his trusted few. A cold cellar on a ridge is a place for storing perishables, for keeping things out of sight and out of mind. The location marked on the map was in a remote, heavily wooded hollow, a good half-mile from the known location of the main camp. The historians felt a grim certainty. This was the place the farmer's son had described. This was where the strangers had been seen digging by lantern light. The pieces were now all on the table: the timber, the tonics, and the silence. The bank drafts showed the means. The teamster's memory provided the method, and the map pointed to the tomb. The dread that had been a shapeless fog over the history of Bearcut Creek now had a location. It had a name: the Cold Cellar. It was a place built to keep secrets, a place designed to swallow men whole. And now, after 60 years of silence, the map was giving them a voice, a final, desperate plea from the grave to be found. The slow-burn dread had found its source. The only question that remained was, what would they find when they finally got there? The spring of 1878 arrived late and angry. The heavy winter snows melted in a rush, turning creeks into torrents and valleys into muddy swamps. The land, frozen and silent for months, seemed to be disgorging the secrets it had been forced to keep. Downstream from Bearcut Creek, a farmer found a mangled axe head washed up on a gravel bar, its handle splintered, its brand matching the one used by the logging concern. A week later, a child discovered a rusted crosscut saw, its teeth bent and broken, tangled in the roots of a sycamore tree. Pieces of the lost camp were surfacing, carried down by the floodwaters. Cooking pots, tin plates, a splintered bunk frame. The physical evidence of the camp's existence was undeniable, but it was a ghost camp. There were no bodies, no bones. No sign of the 32 men who were supposed to have been there. The debris and the eerie lack of human remains reignited the town's fears. The whispers that had been quieted by the winter snows rose again, this time with more urgency. The story no longer felt like a mystery, it felt like a crime. This growing chorus of concern found its voice in the local clergy. The Methodist circuit rider and the Presbyterian minister, men who were usually rivals for the souls of the community, joined forces. They drafted a petition to the county judge, demanding a formal investigation into the disappearance of the Bearcut crew. They presented the petition in the main courtroom, the same room where the WPA historians would later lay out their evidence. The judge, a man named Beauregard Finch, was more a politician than a lawman. He was concerned with budgets and property disputes, not with missing loggers who, in his view, were likely just drifters anyway. He listened to the ministers with a look of polite impatience. Elias Pruitt, who was present as the court clerk, remembered the judge's dismissive wave of the hand. "Gentlemen," Judge Finch said, his voice smooth and condescending, "this is a wilderness. Men wander off. They follow the promise of $1. The company says they were paid and left. I have no evidence to the contrary. The county has no funds for a wild goose chase up a washed-out mountain trail." He officially denied the petition. The case, in the eyes of the law, was closed. But for some, the case was just beginning. It's in moments like these, when official channels fail and the powerful turn a blind eye, that the true character of a community is revealed. As the judge's words spread through the town, a quiet and resolute anger took hold. If the law would not act, they would. And at the forefront of this quiet rebellion was a man who understood the ridge better than anyone. His name was Silas Boone. Silas was a veteran of the war, having served with the Missouri Infantry Unit. He was a lean, hard man in his late 30s, with a quiet intensity that made people listen when he spoke. He made his living as a teamster and a guide, and he had hauled some of the first supplies up to the Bearcut camp before Delling cut off access. 2 of the missing men were cousins of his wife. For Silas, this wasn't an abstract mystery. It was personal. He believed in order, in a man's word, and in the simple, brutal justice of accountability. He saw the judge's inaction not just as a failure of duty, but as an insult to the missing men and their families. Silas didn't make a grand announcement. That wasn't his way. He just started working. He began to assemble a timeline, a patient, methodical reconstruction of the camp's last days. He was not a man of letters, so he did it in a way he understood. He laid out boards across 2 sawhorses in his barn, creating a long, crude table. Each board represented a week, from the day the men were hired until the day the first snow fell. On this timeline, he began to place the facts as he found them. He interviewed the families, getting the exact dates of the last letters they received. He spoke with the general store owner, getting copies of the supply manifests. He talked to the telegraph operator, who remembered Delling sending a flurry of coded messages in late September. He even consulted an old farmer who kept a detailed weather journal, cross-referencing the dates of heavy rains with the state of the mule track. He was, in his own way, building the very case the county refused to. The boards in his barn began to fill up. Hiring dates, supply stops, last letters home, reports of strange activity on the ridge. Each piece of information was like a nail being hammered into a coffin. He was tracking the truth on paper and ground alike. He walked the perimeter of the company's lease, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. He found the spot where Delling had met the teamsters, the turnaround rock, and saw how the ground had been heavily trampled, more than a simple supply transfer would warrant. He saw the signs of many horses, shod and unshod, coming and going at odd hours. He was building a map in his mind, a map that showed a pattern of deception and secrecy. His investigation did not go unnoticed. One evening, as he was returning home, 2 men on horseback blocked the path. They were strangers, the same kind of hard-faced men the teamster boy had described. They didn't threaten him directly. They just sat on their horses, their hands resting on their saddle horns, and watched him pass. The message was clear: stop digging. Silas Boone was not a man who was easily intimidated. The threat only strengthened his resolve. He knew he was getting close. He now believed, with a cold certainty, that the answers lay up on the ridge, at the camp itself, at the place Delling had called the cold cellar. The spring floods had receded, and the mule track, though damaged, was passable. He told his wife he was going up the mountain. He said he would be back in 3 days. He was going to find the truth, or he was going to die trying. He was a man of his word, and he had pledged to the families that he would not rest until their men were accounted for. And Silas Boone never broke a pledge. Just as Silas Boone was preparing to ascend the ridge, the predator slipped away. Horace Delling, or H. Davies, or whatever his real name was, proved to be as adept at vanishing as he was at deception. He didn't flee in a panic, he simply faded, executing a quiet, methodical retreat. He sold the timber company's local assets, mules, wagons, remaining equipment, to a dealer from another county, conducting the entire transaction by mail. The payment was sent to a bank in Memphis, not St. Louis. He was already erasing his tracks. He settled his accounts at the general store and the boarding house with cash, tipping generously and wishing everyone well. To the few who asked about the Bearcut operation, he offered a final, polished lie. The company had encountered unexpected geological problems, he said, and had decided to cut its losses. The men had been paid in full and had moved on. He sounded convincing, regretful even. He was a picture of professional disappointment. Then, one morning in early May of 1878, his rented office was empty. The sign was gone from the window. The man himself was gone. When the marshal finally thought to check with the bank in Springfield, he was told that Mr. Delling's account had been closed out a week prior. The records, the bank manager explained with an apologetic shrug, had been transferred to their head office and were no longer available. Every trail Delling had left, from his signature to his finances, now led to a dead end. He had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but whispers and 32 unanswered questions. The timing of his departure was impeccable. It came just as the anger and suspicion in the community were hardening into a genuine threat, and it coincided with a final, devastating blow to Silas Boone's investigation. Nature itself seemed to be conspiring to keep the mountains secret. A week of heavy spring rains, the kind that turned the red Ozark clay into a slick, heavy paste, had been eating away at the slopes of the ridge. The night before Silas was set to leave, a section of the mountain above the mule track, already destabilized by the logging and blasting, finally gave way. The landslide was immense. An entire hillside of rock, mud, and ancient trees collapsed, sliding down into the ravine and completely obliterating the only path to the lost camp. The sound of it, people later said, was like a long, mournful groan from the earth itself. The Bearcut Ridge was once again sealed off, this time more completely than any winter snow had ever managed. The way was shut. It was a hard reversal, a cruel twist of fate. The evidence was up there, the graves were up there, but they were now as inaccessible as the dark side of the moon. For Silas Boone, the landslide was a challenge, not a defeat. An Army veteran knew more than one way to take a hill. If the main path was gone, he would find another. But fate, or whatever dark force was protecting Delling's secret, was not done with him. A few days after the landslide, while scouting for an alternate route along a treacherous game trail, Silas's bad leg, the one with the lingering reminder of a mini-ball from the war, gave out. He fell 20 feet down a rocky embankment, shattering his ankle and breaking 2 ribs. He was found hours later by a hunting party, barely conscious, his body broken but his will intact. The fall ended his pursuit. The town's one true investigator, the one man with the grit and the knowledge to uncover the truth, was now confined to a bed, his timeline in the barn gathering dust. The investigation stalled. The predator had slipped the noose. The truth was buried, first by lies, then by snow, and now, finally, by 10,000 tons of earth and rock. It was a perfect, crushing silence. The years that followed were quiet ones for the story of Bearcut Creek. The town moved on, as towns do. The children of the missing men grew up. The widows remarried or moved away. The story passed from a fresh wound to a dull ache, and then to a piece of local folklore. Horace Delling was never seen or heard from again. The timber company in St. Louis, when contacted, claimed to have no record of an operation at Bearcut Creek or of a man named Delling. They suggested it was likely a small independent venture that had illicitly used their name. The cover-up was complete, seamless, and yet the truth did not die. It was preserved in fragments by the very people the world had forgotten. It lived in Elias Pruitt's meticulous memory and the margins of his ledgers. It lived in Martha Keene's scrapbook, pressed between clippings of crop prices and political cartoons. It lived in the drawing of a trench with boots, kept safe in a wooden box at the back of a schoolhouse closet. And it lived in the quiet, burning anger of a crippled veteran who could no longer walk the ridges, but who never stopped telling the story to anyone who would listen. The hard reversal was complete. The evidence was there, but it was scattered, hidden under time, snow, and silence. It seemed that justice for the men of Bearcut Creek would never come. But the Ozark Hills are patient. They hold their secrets tight, but not forever. Sometimes it just takes a new generation with a new set of tools to ask the right questions and to finally make the mountains speak. Time has a way of turning tragedies into tales and tales into whispers. By the year 1912, the lost camp of Bearcut Creek was little more than a whisper in Taney County. Most of those who had lived through the events of 1877 were gone. Silas Boone had passed away a decade earlier, his leg having never fully healed. The widows and children of the missing men had either died or moved on, taking their grief with them. The courthouse had been expanded. The old records moved to make way for new ones. For 35 years, the secret held. And then, as so often happens, the past was dislodged by accident. The county decided to install a new furnace in the courthouse, a modern coal-fired beast that required clearing out a section of the dusty, forgotten attic to make room for ventilation pipes. 2 young men were given the thankless job of moving decades of accumulated junk. They worked in the oppressive summer heat, their only light coming from a single grime-covered window. They moved old furniture, broken flags, and boxes upon boxes of obsolete records. One of the boxes, tucked away in a dark corner under the eaves, was different. It was a simple pine crate, its lid nailed shut. On the side, stenciled in faded black ink, were the words, "Timber Tax, 1877. Believing it to be more of the same worthless paperwork, one of the boys pried the lid open with a crowbar. Inside, there was no stack of tax receipts. Instead, there was a strange assortment of items, a chaotic collection that seemed to have been thrown together in a hurry. There was a half-empty bottle of whiskey, a tarnished silver flask, a bundle of official-looking company papers tied with string, and a small leather-bound book. It was a diary, the diary of Horace Delling. It wasn't a complete record. Pages had been torn out, whole sections ripped away. What remained was a collection of fragments, disjointed thoughts written in a looping, arrogant script. But in those fragments, the true nature of the Bearcut Creek operation was laid bare, not as a tragedy, but as a cold-blooded business plan. Delling wrote not of logging, but of finance. He complained about his investors, about debts he had incurred back east. He wrote about the cost of equipment, the price of mules, the rising cost of wages. And then, in an entry dated August 1877, the mask of the respectable businessman fell away completely. "The payroll has become an untenable liability," he wrote. "The men are restless. An expensive crew is an expendable crew." It was a confession, written in the dispassionate language of a corporate ledger. The 32 men were not people to him. They were a line item, a cost to be managed. The next few entries detailed his plan. He mentioned the calming tonic and how it eased the process. He wrote of liquidating the asset, a chillingly sterile phrase for mass murder. He was not just a killer, he was a corporate predator, tidying up his balance sheet. The most damning entry, however, was the last one. It was scrawled across the bottom of the page, the ink bleeding slightly, as if the pen had been pressed with great force. Insurance claim filed for loss of equipment due to flash flood. A clean slate. The pit near the creek is well sealed. They will find nothing. A sealed pit. Insurance fraud. It was all there. The motive, the means, the cover-up. The Bearcut Creek logging concern had never been about timber. It was a phantom company, a stage set for a monstrous fraud, and the 32 men who had signed on with such hope were simply the disposable props. The two boys in the attic didn't fully understand what they had found, but the new county clerk did. He was a young man who had grown up hearing the ghost story of the lost camp. He took the diary and the box downstairs, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. But the story had one more keeper, one final witness who had yet to speak. Martha Keene, the schoolteacher, had retired in 1905, but her legacy remained. She had left her collection of scrapbooks to the school, with a note asking that they be preserved. The new teacher had stored them in an old oak cabinet. When the clerk, now intrigued, began to ask around for any other records from that time, someone remembered the teacher's scrapbooks. He found the volume for 1877. He saw the clippings, the list of names, the handwritten notes about Delling's behavior. And then he found what Martha Keene had tucked away so carefully 35 years before. Folded inside a heavy vellum envelope was the drawing from the 6-year-old girl, the daughter of a missing logger. The clerk unfolded the brittle paper. There it was. A child's crayon rendering of a long, dark trench, and the simple, horrifying detail of little black boots, all in a row, sticking up from the ground. Beneath the drawing, in Martha's neat cursive, was a single, devastating sentence. "Anna says this is where her father is sleeping." The clerk looked from the diary in his hand, from Delling's cold words about a sealed pit, to the child's drawing on his desk. The two artifacts, one from the predator and one from his victim, separated by decades and circumstance, were now telling the exact same story. The case of the lost camp was no longer a ghost story. It was a case with evidence. It had a motive, a confession, and now, thanks to the unfiltered honesty of a child, it had a picture of the grave. The silence of the ridge was about to be broken. The whispers were about to become a roar. The gears of justice, once they finally begin to turn, can grind exceedingly fine, but sometimes they turn so slowly that they seem to stand still. Delling's diary and the child's drawing, discovered in 1912, created a local sensation. The story was picked up by newspapers in Springfield and Kansas City. For a brief moment, the lost camp of Bearcut Creek was famous. But fame is fleeting, and the world was soon distracted by larger events: a looming war in Europe, the sinking of a great ocean liner. The Bearcut Ridge, still wild and inaccessible after the landslide of 1878, kept its secret. The diary was a confession, but the body of the crime was still missing. Without the bodies, there was no case. And so, for another 25 years, the story went quiet again, the evidence filed away in a box in the county sheriff's office, a chilling but ultimately unprovable tale. The final act of this long drama would not be driven by investigators or historians, but by the same force that had started it all: the simple need for a man to earn a wage. In 1937, the Civilian Conservation Corps, a branch of the WPA, was tasked with building a fire access road through the hills of Taney County. The planned route went straight across the old Bearcut Creek timber lease. Young men from all over the state, their faces lean from the hardships of the Great Depression, arrived with bulldozers and dynamite. They were there to tame the wilderness, to carve a modern road through the very landscape that had swallowed 32 men 60 years earlier. An old county surveyor, a man who had been a boy when the story was still fresh, heard about the project. He remembered the hand-drawn map from Delling's ledger, the one showing a spur trail to a place called the Cold Cellar. On a hunch, he pulled the old files and took the map to the CCC foreman. He showed him the location of the X. "Keep your eyes open when you get to this hollow," the surveyor said. "You might find more than just rock and dirt." The foreman, a practical man with little time for ghost stories, agreed, if only to humor the old man. 2 weeks later, a bulldozer operator, clearing a path through a dense thicket of scrub, oak, and pine, hit something that wasn't rock. It was a large, flat slab of limestone, perfectly squared, unnatural in this wild place. It took 6 men with crowbars to pry it up. Beneath it was a dark opening, and a set of crude stone steps leading down into the earth. They had found the Cold Cellar. It wasn't a cellar, it was a tomb. The first thing they found, at the bottom of the steps, were the remains of 5 men, laid out side by side. But it was the rest of the pit that told the true story. It was filled, almost to the top, with a chaotic jumble of human artifacts. Dozens of pairs of work boots, caked in mud, tin plates and cups. Axes and saws, their handles rotted away. And in a corner, a pile of leather wallets, their contents preserved by the cool, dry air. Inside one was a faded photograph of a woman and 2 small children. Inside another, a letter from a wife, the ink still faintly legible. "Come home safe," it read. It was a mass grave, not of bodies, but of belongings. Delling, in his meticulous, cost-cutting evil, hadn't buried all the men here. He had disposed of them, and then used this pit to dispose of their identities, to erase any proof that they had ever existed. This was the loss of equipment he had claimed in his insurance fraud. The community gathered at the site as word spread. Old men and women, the children and grandchildren of the missing, came to stand at the edge of the pit, their faces a mixture of grief and grim validation. The truth was finally out. Elias Pruitt, now a frail but determined man of 81, was there. He helped identify some of the items, matching a distinctive belt buckle to the Sutter family, a worn pocket knife to one of the Boone cousins. With the physical evidence finally unearthed, the law at last took an interest in Horace Delling. But 60 years is a long time to hide. A state-level investigation traced his movements after he left Missouri. He had gone to Memphis, then to New Orleans, and finally to California, changing his name multiple times, always one step ahead of the past. They finally found him, not in a mansion bought with blood money, but in the records of a state asylum in Northern California. He had died in 1921 under the name Arthur Finch, his mind reportedly destroyed by paranoia and dementia. He had spent the last 10 years of his life terrified of men in the walls, whispering his name from the dark. He never faced a judge or a jury. There would be no trial, no hanging. But in a way, justice had found him. The man who had silenced 32 voices had died in a place where no one listened, his own mind becoming the prison he had built for others. The predator had been consumed by his own ghosts. The exposure of his crimes had one final fitting consequence. Delling, under one of his aliases, had become a wealthy man, leaving behind a considerable estate to a distant, unsuspecting family branch. With the proof of the insurance fraud and the murders now undeniable, the state of Missouri sued the estate. The courts ordered that a portion of Delling's ill-gotten fortune be used to fund a permanent memorial at Bearcut Creek. His own money, the very thing he had killed for, would now be used to ensure that the names of his victims were never forgotten. The payback was complete. Fate, it seemed, had kept its own set of books, and the account was finally being settled. In the autumn of 1938, more than 60 years after the last axe fell, the people of the valley gathered once more to go up the ridge. This time, they did not travel by a winding mule track, but by a new graded road, carved into the mountainside by the young men of the CCC. They came not with the hope of wages, but with the sober purpose of memory. At the entrance to the hollow where the Cold Cellar had been found, A simple granite marker had been set, paid for by the final, unwilling contribution of Horace Delling. The day was crisp and clear, the sky a piercing blue. The same Ozark hills that had once hidden a great crime now stood as silent, solemn witnesses to its resolution. They came from all over the county. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the lost men, the descendants of Martha Keene and Silas Boone, and at the center of the gathering was Elias Pruitt, his 82 years weighing on him, but his eyes clear and his purpose firm. He held in his hands the old paymaster's ledger, the very book that had started this long journey back to the truth. There were no long speeches, there were no politicians. There was only the sound of the wind in the tall pines and the quiet dignity of a community that had refused to forget. The local minister said a short prayer, not for the dead, whose struggles were long over, but for the living, for whom the memory of this place still carried a heavy weight. Then Elias Pruitt stepped forward. He opened the ledger to the first page of the roster, its paper yellowed and brittle with age. His voice, thin but steady, cut through the silence. "We are here today," he said, "to finish the bookkeeping, to give these men back their names." And he began to read. He read the first name, Abner Cole, and then he paused. From the small crowd, a woman stepped forward. "Here," she said, her voice choked with emotion. She was Abner Cole's granddaughter. One by one, Elias read the names, and one by one, a descendant or a member of the community would answer for them, reclaiming them from the anonymity of the grave. Silas Boone, Jr. Here. Thomas Sutter. Here. William Henderson. Here. 32 names read aloud into the Ozark air. 32 men who had gone up a ridge seeking a living and had found a grave, their identities now restored, their stories finally told. When the last name had been read, a silence fell over the hollow. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of a 60-year-old secret. It was a peaceful silence, a silence of closure. The old church bell from the town below, too far to be heard clearly, was rung 32 times, its faint, distant toll carrying on the wind, a final salute to the lost crew. Wrongs had been recorded, dignity had been restored. The marker was set, its chiseled letters ensuring that no one who passed this way would ever be ignorant of what had happened here. The story of Bearcut Creek is a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a polite smile and a firm handshake. It's a story about greed, and how the relentless pursuit of profit can corrode a man's soul, turning him from a businessman into a monster. But it is also a story of resilience, of the stubborn, quiet courage of ordinary people who refuse to let the truth be buried. It is a testament to the quiet archivist, the tireless investigator, and the keeper of records. To a teacher like Martha Keene, who believed a child's drawing was evidence, to a veteran like Silas Boone, who was willing to walk into the darkness to find the light, and to a clerk like Elias Pruitt, who understood that the most important history is the history of a name. The ridge keeps no secret forever. The earth itself will eventually give up its dead. A lie can be built with careful precision, fortified by power and silence, but it is a fragile structure. All it takes is one small crack, a penciled note in a margin, a child's memory, a dusty box in an attic, for the whole edifice to collapse. After the ceremony, as the families began the slow walk back down the mountain, Elias Pruitt remained behind. He stood before the granite marker for a long time, the old ledger still in his hands. Then, with a pencil he had brought for this single purpose, he turned to the page with the frantic, questioning scrawl he had first seen 60 years ago. 32 men hired, 5 discharged. Others? He carefully drew a line through the word others and the question mark. And in the space below, in the neat, steady cursive he had perfected over a lifetime of service, he wrote the final entry for the Bearcut Creek logging concern. He wrote the names of all 27 men who had been murdered, and when he was done he closed the book, and across the final page he wrote 2 last words, "Account settled."